Hey, thanks to Greg for filling in and Don's absence today. And welcome to Scott, who has assumed a position of lead guitarist. Really great job today. Fathers and sons, brothers and friends all wrestle from time to time, don't they? I mean, how many of you fathers, even if your sons are grown up and are gone now, wrestle with your sons from time to time? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah. When Rob was little, I used to pretend to do some World Wrestling Federation moves on him. And I have to apologize to you. I did one for the first service and pulled my hamstring. And so I'm not going to be able to demonstrate here for second service. And how many of you guys had a brother growing up that you wrestled with? My brother was bigger than me, so he always could whip me. And friends wrestle. One year on New Year's Eve, during my sophomore year in high school, early in the morning, I was over at my friend Chuck Bailey's house, and we were wrestling. And in wrestling with him, I separated my shoulder. I mean, it was really painful. But what was even worse than that was New Year's Eve at our church youth group New Year's Eve party, I was to play the guitar, and I mean, it really hurt then, but some of the people said, hey, it sounded better than it ever did before, so I don't know what that means. Today in our Old Testament Characters Summer Message Series, we come to Jacob wrestling with God. Now, I would assume that this idea of wrestling with God gets your attention, and this is a study that's going to give us a lot to think about. The account is in Genesis chapter 32, but before we come to that, I think we need to really familiarize ourselves with the background to this. And remember, one of our purposes this summer is not just to look at these Old Testament characters, but also to become more familiar with this very important part of the Bible that we call the Old Testament. So the background really begins back in Genesis chapter 12 when God called and made a covenant with a man named Abraham to make a great nation out of him through which he would bless the entire world. And a number of years after God made this promise, Abraham and Sarah were blessed with a son they named Isaac. Now, the specific background to this morning's Bible reference is with regard to Jacob, has to do with his family, his father Isaac, who was born to Abraham and Sarah, his mother Rebekah, and his older brother Esau. Jacob and his brother Esau were twins, and their relationship was uncommon from the beginning. We're told about that in Genesis chapter 25 and verses 24 to 26. When the time came for her, that is Rachel, to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was, Rebekah. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. See, even though they were twins, Esau was born first. He was therefore the older, and that had extreme significance in this culture. And notice, if you have your Bible open, the footnote in the New International Version about his name Jacob. Jacob means he grabs the heel, and that's a Hebrew idiom for he deceives. Now, another insight into their uncommon relationship is given in verses 27 and 28 there. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, the final happening with regard to the immediate family here, the next thing was when Jacob tricked Esau out of his older brother's birthright, and we read about that in verses 29 to 33. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That's why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. And that was very, very significant. And the last happening with regard to the immediate family in terms of this background was when Jacob's mother, Rebekah, and Jacob conspired to take Isaac, the father's blessing that should have gone to the older of the two, Esau, but they got him to give it to Jacob. A blessing in this culture was extremely important, more so than today, and it's something that everyone wanted. And in this family especially, the line of Abraham, the father's blessing was significant. And we read about this in Genesis chapter 27 and verses 1 to 4. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son?" "Here am I," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food that I like and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Now, Rebekah, his mother and Isaac's wife, was listening, and after Esau left to do what his father asked him to do, she called Jacob in and told him to get some domestic meat, and that she would prepare it so that Jacob could get Isaac's blessing. Jacob pointed out to his mother how they were so different, that surely Isaac would know the difference, but she insisted, telling him that she would take care of it. So she took this food and prepared it in a way that would fool Isaac, and she dressed Jacob in Isaac's clothes, and she put goat skin on his hands and his neck, and sent him in to Isaac. And so let's pick up the story beginning with verse 18. He went to his father and said, "My father." "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of the game so that you may give me your blessing." Isaac asked his son, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" "The Lord your God gave me success," he replied. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau, so he proceeded to bless him. "Are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "I am," he replied. Then he said, "My son, bring me some of your game to eat so that I may give you my blessing." Jacob brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought some wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come here, my son, and kiss me." So he went to him and kissed him. And when Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him. Now, I want us to realize that right after Jacob left, Esau came in, and he learned from his father Isaac what had happened. And I want us to see what he said in verse 36 of 27. Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing." And let's close the loop by reading verses 41 to 45. Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob." When Rebekah was told what her older son Esau had said, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Your brother Esau is planning to avenge himself by killing you. Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay there with him for a while until your brother's fury subsides. When your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him, I'll send word for you to come back from here. Why should I lose both of you in one day?" Now, the incident that we're going to come to today with Jacob wrestling with God happens 20 years later. Jacob took his mother's advice, he left, and he stayed for 20 years, and now he's on his way back to the homeland. He has 2 wives and 2 concubines and numerous children as he comes to meet his brother Esau. And we don't have time to go over the details of that 20 years, but they're almost as interesting, if not as interesting, as what we've just looked at. And there's quite a bit of trickery during the 20 years between Jacob and his uncle, father-in-law, Laban, all the way through the time he left to go home. I want to note what had taken place just prior to the account that we're going to look at. Jacob, in coming, separated his family into two parts. His servants into two parts, his possessions, and even his children, thinking that if Esau attacked one of the groups, the other one would live. And he sent messengers ahead with gifts to meet Esau to soften him up. Look at chapter 32 of Genesis, verses 17 to 21. He instructed the one in the lead, when my brother Esau meets you and asks, who do you belong to and where are you going and who owns all these animals in front of you? Then you're to say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They're a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us. He also instructed the second and the third and all the others who followed the herds, you're to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And be sure to say your servant Jacob is coming behind us. For he thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me. Now, the most important thing that Jacob did before we come to the incident of wrestling with God is he prayed. Back in Genesis chapter 32 and verses 9 to follow. Didn't Jacob pray, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I've become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. Isn't that one of the greatest prayers of the Old Testament? The prayer here is what I believe is the key to this incident that we're coming to. Jacob claims the promises of God. He humbles himself before God, and he asks God for his help. So the account that we want to look at today is in Genesis 32, verses 22 to 31. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched, and he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. In somewhat of an understatement, one writer says this text is shrouded with mystery, and yet we want to try and understand it. And I think the way for us to do that is by asking some questions. The first question is, with whom did Jacob wrestle? Was it a man, an angel, or God himself? Verse 24 tells us a man came and wrestled with him. But in verse 30, afterwards, Jacob says, I have seen God face to face. And later on, the prophet Hosea in Hosea 12:4 tells us that it was an angel. I think it was all three. Jacob clearly had no idea who it was or what he wanted until daybreak. And so before that daybreak, I think he assumed it was a man. And elsewhere in the Bible, God himself, as well as angels from time to time, appear to human beings in human form. It was God, or it was the angel of the Lord, which is a phrase in the Old Testament referring to God, in human form. Now let's ask this second question. Were they really physically wrestling? Or was it only a dream? Was it something that happened only in Jacob's heart and mind, like intense prayer? Well, I think it was clearly more than simply a spiritual battle. It involved the physical as well. And note that Jacob was not the initiator of the conflict. A man came and wrestled with him. It's almost as though Jacob would say to God, he started it. It wasn't Jacob's idea. And then related to this question, was the wrestling physical? What's going on with this injury to Jacob's hip? That certainly suggests that it was a physical contest, doesn't it? And as Jacob left the place, he was limping, the text says, because of the injury to his hip. Old Testament scholar Walter Kaiser asserts, in order to preserve Jacob's memory of this spiritual crisis, God left a permanent mark on his body. From that day forward, everywhere he walked, Jacob limped. You see, God had the power to disable Jacob at any time he wanted. Why didn't he? Why did he wrestle all night with him? Well, the struggle, I think, was necessary for Jacob's growth to the point where God wanted him to be. One writer says Jacob needed to reach the point where he had no more strength. He was totally exhausted. And God was holding back, allowing Jacob to exert all of his strength and almost win until the morning came. And then fourthly, what's this blessing that Jacob so desperately wanted? As dawn broke, he realized he was wrestling with God. And he wanted God to bless him. He wanted the blessing that God had given to his grandfather, Abraham, and to his own father, Isaac. He had been trying to get God's blessing all of his life. And he gained the blessing in part by conniving his brother out of the birthright and then deceiving his father for the blessing of the oldest son. But at some level, Jacob knew none of this was really God's blessing. And he wanted the real thing. And now there was no way for him by trickery or cunning or his own strength to get it. If God was going to bless him, it would have to be a gift of God. One writer notes he had no more tricks up his sleeve. He had no bargains left to make. He only had one leg to stand on. So what's going on here with this asking of names and back and forth and then the changing of his name? Why did God ask Jacob his name? He certainly knew it already. That's why he came to Jacob. Well, it was for Jacob's benefit. Remember earlier, his earthly father Isaac had asked him his name, and he had lied, saying, I am Esau. And he had stolen the blessing. Now, after all those 20 years, he was once more seeking a blessing. But this time he was seeking the blessing from his all-knowing, all-seeing, heavenly Father. One pastor suggests God asked Jacob his name not because he didn't know it. He wanted to know if Jacob knew it. He wanted to know if Jacob was willing to come to grips with who he really was, or whether he was going to continue to fight the Lord. And there's great significance in the changing of Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel. Changing his name meant a shift from his conniving usurper character to being the legitimate heir of the covenant that God had made with his people through his grandfather, Abraham. And his new name says a lot about this experience he just had and his character. And not only that, the changing of a person's name in that culture was a way to exercise authority over a person. When a king would conquer another nation, he would often change the name of the king he conquered to indicate that he was now subject to him, much like the king of Babylon did when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken to Babylon, and the king of Babylon changed their names. Now, after this encounter with God, and after his name was changed, Jacob, or should I say Israel, never stooped again to his tricky ways. Well, with that before us, let's attempt to apply this account to our lives today. And I think the way for us to do that is by, again, asking some questions. Do people still wrestle with God today? Well, yes and no. Well, I'm sure it could happen. My impression is that we do not physically wrestle with God as Jacob did. But we certainly do wrestle with God, don't we? Some wrestle with him in terms of whether or not to accept or reject his offer of grace salvation through Jesus Christ. Some of you have had that experience. Some believers wrestle with God over a decision that they must make. And some of you have had that experience. I just went through it, wrestling with God. What should I do? And some of you are wrestling with God about a decision this morning. Some wrestle with God in terms of doing or not doing something that's questionable, or doing or not doing something right that they know God wants them to do it, and they're wrestling with God over that. My sense is that Jesus was wrestling with God in the Garden of Gethsemane the Thursday night before he was arrested, tried, and crucified. See, God was pursuing Jacob, and he still pursues people today. He struggles with those upon whom his love is fixed. And while he could overpower us so easily, he doesn't. We wish he would, but he doesn't. And often the struggle results in a blessing in our lives and in our increased faith in the Lord. Here's the second question. Does God still grant blessings to people today? Of course he does. And he does so in so many ways. My testimony to you this morning is that God has greatly blessed me, and in more ways than I will ever know. And God has blessed me and blesses me in indirect ways, often through other people. I've had a whole truckload of blessings poured out on me through many of you and people who are part of the body of Christ here at Discovery. Perhaps we should ask ourselves a third question. Do we want God's blessing today? I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves and honest with God. We have to admit to ourselves who we really are, like I think Jacob had to. And then with God's help, give ourselves as completely as we can to the Lord. One pastor put it this way: Jacob wanted God's blessing, but he did not want God's ownership of his life. He wanted God to bail him out in the hard times, but he did not want to submit to God in everyday living. Jacob had a surface faith in that he wanted the benefits of God, but not the relationship with God. Jacob's problem was not his impending meeting with Esau. His real problem was his superficial relationship with the Lord of the universe. And you and I have to decide if we really want God's blessing on our life. And if we do, it may very well entail a new identity, moving from being lost to saved, from unforgiven to forgiven, from being an enemy of God to being a child of God, from being a rebel of God to being a friend of God, from being self-reliant and hard-nosed to being broken and trusting in God. One pastor suggests that wrestling with God gives us a new identity, but it doesn't leave us unscathed. And the scars in our lives can serve to remind us of our spiritual journey and what we have learned as we have wrestled with God and become more and more the person he wants us to be. Now, as the band comes, I don't know about you, but this idea of wrestling with God gets my attention. I don't completely understand it, but I'm intrigued by it, and I love it. The God who blessed Jacob is the same God who wants to bless you and me today. And he doesn't bless us because we deserve to be blessed or because we're good enough to be blessed. You see, if God only blessed perfect people, there would be no hope for any of us. And if you've been wrestling with God at some level, I want to challenge you this morning to hold on, to keep wrestling, and ask God to bless you. Because God's blessing upon us is really about his grace being poured out on us.